Have you ever wondered if simply buying more stuff is enough to keep an economy growing? It's a common belief that when people spend more, businesses thrive, jobs are created, and the economy expands. But is consumption really the secret ingredient for long-term growth? While it's true that consumer spending drives demand and fuels economic activity, there's a bigger picture to consider. What about innovation, investment, or the productivity of industries? Is it possible that relying solely on consumption might leave economies vulnerable or unsustainable? Let's dive into this intriguing question and explore what really powers growth. It's understood that an economy's growth is like sailing on two boats tugged to each other. On one side is the supply or the production of goods and services. GDP is the value the production process adds. On the other side, there is demand or expenditure for purchasing these goods and services from the market. Both the supply and the demand boats must move in tandem. If supply proceeds slower than demand, prices rise, leading to inflation. If demand falls behind, firms will be left with unsold inventories, which may lead to cuts in future production, job and income losses, and a worsening cycle of demand and growth slowdown. It's important to note that the demand or aggregate expenditure in an economy comes from four sources. First is private consumption, which is the sum of expenditures by all individuals on items such as food, clothing, and mobile phones. Second is private investment, which is the amount spent by firms and households on installing new machines and constructing new factories or residences. Third is government expenditure. For consumption and investment, it refers to the money spent on day-to-day government operations, including paying salaries to officers, teachers, doctors, and others attached to public institutions. Fourth is net export of goods and services while engaging in trade with the rest of the world. Investment and its multipliers. Investment is powerful because it can boost the economy more than the amount spent. For example, if the government invests 100 rupees in building a highway, it could end up increasing the economy's total demand and GDP by 125 rupees. This happens because workers and businesses involved in the project spend their income, creating more demand. The effect is stronger in less developed areas, but when people just spend more, it doesn't have as big of an impact on the overall economy. For economists like Keynes, consumption is a smaller, less active part of the economy's growth. Indian and Chinese experiences. India's economic growth over the last decade has been driven mainly by expanding domestic consumption expenditures. In 2023, private consumption as a share of GDP was 60.3% in India compared to 39.1% in China. The dominance of consumption in India's GDP structure is mainly due to the weaknesses of the other components of aggregate demand in the country. The shares of investment and government consumption expenditure are relatively low. India also has a trade deficit, with its import of goods and services being larger than its exports, reducing domestic demand. India's growth driven by consumption is not only slower than investment-led growth, but it also aggravates inequalities. The growth of jobs, incomes, and consumption has remained depressed for many Indians, and they will be left behind. Over the last decade, India's economic growth has largely been fueled by increasing domestic consumption. To summarize, I would say that consumption can drive short-term growth. However, it will be slower and less sustainable than investment-driven growth, and it also worsens inequality. Many Indians still face stagnant jobs, low incomes, and limited access to consumption growth, leaving a large part of the population behind. In times of economic uncertainty, when private businesses hesitate to invest, the government must step in to encourage growth and ensure broader benefits.